It's always a blast when two finance lovers come together. I'm about to go in on a Zoom chat with a friend and a guest for today, and we'll be talking about securitization. That word is always a tongue twister for me. But yes, we'll be talking about securitization or transactions. So stay tuned and enjoy it. So, good morning. You're welcome to the Law, Finance, and Economic Policy Talk Show, where we dissect laws, guidelines, and regulations that affect Nigeria and Africa's economy. On today's episode, we have a very, very important guest, John Sunday Okeluwe. John is a lawyer. He's a corporate finance specialist. He's also an economic policy enthusiast, and it's really good to have him on the show today. Just a bit to toot his horn. He's a transactional lawyer with years of experience. He has banking and finance law experts, corporate finance transaction experts. He also has the master's from the Institute for Law and Finance. I might murder the pronunciation, but it's the Goethe University Frankfurt, and he has an LLM in law and finance. So that just goes to show that he knows what he's saying. Another fun fact is that he's an acknowledged ILFR rising star. So yes, we have a legal star in our midst. So just to go into the topic of today. So we know that financing generally, financing by companies, by nations, is something that essentially runs the wheels of any organization or any nation. And we know that there's been a lot of pressure on different financing vehicles that we have, the traditional financing vehicles that we have. So what has been happening in recent times is that there have been alternative means of financing. And on today's episode, we'll be talking about one of those alternative means of financing that is actually a hot topic right now. And what we'll be talking about is securitization. So on May, something interesting just by way of news is that in May of this 2023, we had the Debt Management Office release a statement essentially saying that there was going to be a securitization of the 22.7 trillion Naira ways and means advances of the Central Bank of Nigeria. There's not much clarity on this, but what we understand is that the federal government was essentially going to be securitizing those the ways and means debts that have been obtained from the central bank in previous times. And the aim was to reduce the debt portfolio, sort of refinance it, and also to reduce the debts on the balance sheet of the government. Although we don't have much information on that, but it's just interesting that this also coincides with the conversation that we're having today. So I'm just going to put the ball in your court, John. So just tell us a bit about the financing landscape and why we're now having to consider, alternative means of financing in recent times in Europe and in Africa, across the globe generally.
Thank you very much, and good day, our viewers. Nice being here, I must say. So, with respect to financing globally, a lot of things have been happening. Currently, the market is a little bit slow. I think inflation is biting very hard. So most central banks and regulators have increased interest rates at the interbank level, and of course, by implication, that has also impacted the lending market completely. Not only the lending market, even the M&A space, because generally purchasers will always want to borrow money from banks and other lenders to buy assets. So that has really slowed down. And of course, there are projections that probably before the end of the year, things will pick up. Nigeria is not an exception. Of course, things have slowed down. The interest rate in Nigeria right now is very high, like 18.75%. That's a record high in recent time. Then in issue of securitization is not really something that is new. It has always been there, actually. It has been there for like a couple of years, for a couple of decades. That was also one of the main things that led to the financial crisis of 2008. If you remember, the subprime mortgage crisis in the US that happened, and it affected the global economy. So after that 2008 subprime mortgage crisis, the market for securitization went very deep. It dipped down. the market became very slow. It affected a lot of markets, and investors became extremely skeptical. And of course, governments across the world had to step in to assist the financial institutions so that they don't go bankrupt. Allowing that to happen could have, made the impact could have been more. So after the financial crisis, things started improving, and regulators had to step in and start putting in more stringent regulations on issuance of securitization in the market, basically. So for it to do securitization, there are regulations. Almost every country in the world that have some form of securitizations have one or two regulations in place. In the EU, is very stringent. They have a regulation in place. So in the EU, that's what we call regulation and directive. So regulation has a direct application to every EU member state. In other words, the local legislators need not make any other law to apply that particular regulation. It has direct application. Whereby directive, on the other hand, is more or less like a recommendation. These are the minimum requirements that the laws that the member states will pass will have to meet. So they have a regulation that is applicable to every member state, even though you may still have one or two laws, local laws of securitization in your country, but it will not have to, it cannot conflict with the regulation that has been issued by the Commission. In Nigeria, too, we also have a securitization regulation that was issued by SEC some couple of years ago. The regulation is not extremely robust compared to that of Europe, obviously. But we also have a securitization bill before the National Assembly. It was introduced in the 9th Assembly, and we hope that in this 10th Assembly, the National Assembly will pass the bill into law. It is not still comprehensive compared to that of Europe, but it's way better off than the regulation we have from that was issued by SEC. So that's what the market is at the moment.
So can you give us just like a general overview of what the differences are, or let's even start from the basics. For the layperson who is listening, what is securitization? What does it entail as a means of financing?
Okay, thank you very much. I'll break it as simple as possible. So securitization is a situation whereby you package illiquid assets. You package illiquid assets and make it liquid. So when I say illiquid assets, meaning assets that ordinarily they're not transferable, you make them transferable. So I will use some very basic examples. So let's assume that a bank in Nigeria, a mortgage bank, for example, or even a commercial bank that have a mortgage window, so has given out a lot of mortgages to be it individuals or corporate. The bank may be in need of more funding, or the bank may want to clear off their balance sheet, so they will get a positive and a regulatory treatment. The bank can just wake up and say, okay, what we're going to do is that we're going to package some of these mortgages we have given out, because the way those mortgages are, individual mortgages, ordinarily they are not liquid. In other words, you can't just wake up one fateful day and start transferring them. It's not that easy. So let's package them together, sell it to a company, then the company pay us some money, then the company can then trade. They can then issue securities on the back of those mortgage. And of course, being a security that is tradable, investors can buy and sell. So that's just a simple way of looking at it. And in most cases, the borrowers, that is the mortgagors now, may not even know that transaction has actually taken place, because it will be structured in such a way that you may not necessarily need to go and get consent from the mortgagors, that is the borrowers in the first place. It can be structured that way, and it can also be structured in a way that the borrower will continue having a direct interface with the bank that gave them the loan. So in most cases, the borrowers don't even know what is happening, but the security will be issued, the loan will be taken out from the balance sheet of the bank, and it will no longer be an issue for the bank anymore. It won't be on their balance sheet. So they will get a positive regulatory rating, because they have more cash, they don't have liability anymore, and at the same time they have cash in their portfolio that they can use for any other thing they want to do. So in a nutshell, Securitization is just a situation whereby you package assets, different types of different assets, but of course assets in the same class, and you sell them usually to a company, which usually is a special purpose company. Then the company issues security on the back of that asset, then pay for the asset, and of course trade the assets to the investors. And in most cases they are listed, and investors can always trade on the exchange.
So what's usually the transaction flow? So for example, in your article, you had this really nice diagram that explains the transaction flow from the originator to the special purpose vehicle, to, the servicer. So just give us like the general typical transaction flow.
Okay, so first of all, there are about 3 types of securitization. We have, but a very common one is what we call the traditional securitization. Then we have in Europe, we have what they call synthetic securitization, and we have loan securitization, which is a little bit different one. It's just more or less like one portfolio of loan you securitize. So, but the one that is very common is a traditional securitization. And basically what happens is, if you want to do securitization, one thing that is fundamental, and by the way, securitization is not just for banks. Many institutions can do securitization. You can be a car company, maybe you can do securitization, maybe a lease company, or maybe a company that have your business model is such a way that you can buy a product today and pay subsequently. You can do securitization on that. Rentals, you can do securitization on your rentals. You can do securitization on your credit card. You can do securitization on the project finance. Even project finance, you can do securitization on that. So
even governments as well.
Yeah, definitely, of course. Government, like I said, almost everything can be securitized. Almost everything. So basically the structure, and I will continue using something very simple that our audience will understand. Let's assume a bank wants to do securitization, a Nigerian bank. So one of the things you're going to do is to set up an SPV. So now the SPV is very important that SPV is completely not attached. I'm breaking it down very simple. It's completely have no ownership link with that very bank. Now, this is very important because of insolvency remoteness. You need to make sure that SPV or the sponsor is completely insolvent remote from the SPV. To achieve this, what you would do is you set up what we call orphan SPV, an SPV where the where the shareholders, and the bank is not one of the shareholders. Usually trustees are the shareholders of the SPV, which is very important. So once you do that, it means that that particular SPV do not have any direct connection with the party that is willing to sell those underlying portfolio. Now, it's very important because in an event of insolvency of, let's say, the seller, that is the bank here, or whoever, the company that is packaging the portfolio in the first place, if this particular bankruptcy remoteness is not there, it means once a liquidator is appointed, the liquidator will step in, and the liquidator is going to, based on consolidation of balance sheets of a group of companies, because the liquidator will treat that SPV as a subsidiary of the company that is going under liquidation. So it will affect the underlying portfolio that had been sold from the parent company to the SPV. So that's first thing you need to do. Set up your SPV and ensure that the SPV is completely bankruptcy remote from the seller. That's the first thing. Then the seller sells the portfolio, and it must be a true sale. In other words, that the buyer cannot have a recourse against the seller. It must be a true sale of the assets. The mortgages, for example, it must be a true sale from the seller to the buyer. So it will leave the balance sheet of the seller and it will sit on the balance sheet of the buyer. Very important. Now, if you have done this, which is one of the most critical aspects of securitization, then the next thing, which is also very important, is this. And one thing about the SPV is that the SPV cannot have employees. That's basically the rule. Both in Nigeria and in most other jurisdictions, it will not have employees. So you need somebody that will continue managing the portfolio. Remember that you have people that are supposed to be paying back interest on those loans as time goes on. So you need someone that will continue interacting with those customers, interacting with them, ensuring that they pay their money as at when due, even follow up with them when they default. So in doing so, the SPV need to appoint a servicer. A servicer is just a party that will help and ensure that the underlying portfolio is in a performing stage. It's continue perform. And the best person to do it in most cases is the seller, because the seller already has a relationship with the borrowers or with the parties that are in charge of the underlying portfolio. So they have that relationship already. So you appoint the servicer, but there is no rule that says that it must be the seller that will act as a servicer. You can appoint a third party, nothing prevents you from doing that. But in most cases, you appoint the seller. So the seller acts as a servicer, and of course, is entitled to his fee for providing that services. Then the seller continue interfacing with the borrowers to the extent that the seller has power to enforce those loans if the buyers default, if the underlying borrowers default. They have the power to enforce those loans in accordance with their normal market practice. So that's another very important party in the value chain. Then another party in the value chain, especially in common law jurisdiction, is trustees. So trustees, of course, when you're issuing securities like this, you need to have trustees. The trustees interface directly with the issuer and, of course, with the investors. So the issuer will now package based on that portfolio it has bought. It will then issue securities on the back of it to the public or to investors, as the case may be. Then the trustee will act as a go-between between the buyer, that is the SPV now, and the investors. So the investors buy securities, and the trustees is acting on their behalf. Now, additionally, you may have, of course, because it's a mortgage, the borrowers at that level that borrow the money from the bank will have mortgaged that very property in question that they are buying, that they took loan from to buy. It's also possible that they might have also provided additional collateral. So when the issuer is buying the collateral, he has to buy the portfolio together with the collateral. So in other words, everything moves to the issuer at that point. So you may have your security trustee also, who will be there to act on behalf of the secure parties. So your security trustee will be there. Maybe you're creating security over accounts and what have you. So the security trustee will be there, and the security trustee will be in charge of the securities. Then another party that is also very important is, of course, your financial advisors. They are the ones that will help you arrange the transaction in the first place. They will help you reach out to investors and the rest. They play a major role in the transaction, and in most cases, especially in Nigeria, they are the ones that drive the transactions. In other jurisdictions, lawyers actually drive the transaction, not the other way around. Then another critical party is that now having the structure is somehow forming, but there's something that is maybe missing out. And the thing is this: because this loan will be coming from the payments for these investors will be getting their money from time to time periodically, and the money will only be coming from the borrowers that took those loans for the mortgage in the first place. So there's a chance in the future that there could be a shortfall for the money that these borrowers have paid to the SPV. So the SPV may not be able to make payment to the investors as at when due. So to tackle this particular challenge, it is very common for the SPV to take up a loan, a revolving credit facility. So a revolving credit facility is a line of credit that the borrower can draw from time to time, but the borrower will not exceed a given limit. So the borrower can take up a revolving credit facility, and there's nothing wrong from the borrower taking up that revolving credit facility from the seller. The seller can give the borrower the loan, but it will be treated as a loan, and it will form part of the obligation of the issuer SPV. Is very important. So when it comes to repayment, if you go to the repayment provision of the documentation, you will see how the money will move, how payment will be made to each party. It's very critical, this very aspect. Now, also to point out, it's so important to note that the seller cannot provide guarantee. Cannot provide guarantee. And the reason is, by the time the seller provides guarantee, then that guarantee will sit on the balance sheet of the seller. In other words, the seller is still the one funding the transaction. So because of that bankruptcy remoteness arrangement, the seller cannot provide guarantee for the issuer SPV. It's very important. This very one is non-negotiable. So this is roughly the arrangement. Of course, you have your law firms that will assist with the whole structuring and arrangement as the case may be. So this is just like a rough sketch of how a simple securitization transaction typically take place. It can be more complex than this, depending on the structure you have, depending on what you want to achieve. But like I said, primarily when you're doing conventional transaction like this, the aim usually from the seller perspective is, one, you want to generate cash. It's very important to generate cash, which is one fundamental difference between the conventional securitization and synthetic securitization. You want to generate cash. Then secondly, if you're a regulated entity like banks, it also help in improving not just your balance sheet, but help you to get a positive regulatory treatment. Because by the time you sell it off, it's no longer in your balance sheet. You don't need to keep money aside for those particular liability. So it helps your balance sheet a lot.
You mentioned a synthetic securitization. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so for synthetic securitization, I don't think it has ever happened in Nigerian market, and even in other advanced markets, it's very rare. So very few institutions typically do that, like banks and investment firms, like the very big ones. And it's a very simple structure. But what happens here is this: the borrower, the seller here doesn't get cash. So a simple structure of synthetic securitization could be a situation whereby the bank, let's use a bank, want to maybe get a positive regulatory treatment. So when I keep saying positive regulatory treatment, is for every loan you give out, there's an expectation you keep out certain amount of money aside. Yeah, because of the loan you give out to mitigate the risk, basically. So sometimes, and once you give out more loan, it means you need to keep money aside. And the implication of that is that if you don't do that, the lesser money you keep, the lesser regulatory treatment you're going to get. So the bank may decide to say, you know what, we want to push out this very risk. We want to get a better regulatory treatment. The one we have been getting is not so good. So they can structure a simple transaction, set up an SPV again. Now, the SPV will issue note to investors, generate money, let's say generate 100 million Naira, for instance. Then the company, that's the bank now, will pay the SPV. The SPV will provide guarantee on those loans that we are taking. So the guarantee is what they are basically buying. In other words, the risk moves from the bank to the SPV. So of course, the bank will then pay for a guarantee fee. Let me use the word guarantee fee to the SPV. And the SPV, the money it's raised, the 100 million, for example, it has raised, they're providing guarantee of up to 100 million for that portfolio of loan that the bank has. Then the SPV can invest the 100 million in another tradable instrument or in a very liquid asset. So in doing so, the bank doesn't get cash. But because another party have taken up the liability, in other words, by providing guarantee, it will get a positive regulatory treatment, even though the asset is still on the balance sheet of the bank. The asset will be there, but another party is providing guarantee that once any of these assets default or all these assets default, we will step in and pay you for those assets. So you get a very good regulatory treatment for that, but you don't get cash. The bank doesn't get cash. However, if you want to get cash, it's still possible. If the bank wants to get cash, remember that the SPV had 100 million note it has issued and it has 100 million. So you can set up the structure in such a way that the bank can then issue bond to the SPV and get the 100 million back. But the bank will have to pay back that very money. But in doing so, don't forget that the 100 million will now sit on the balance sheet of the bank again, that they have an obligation to the SPV, a separate obligation to the SPV. So it all depends on what the parties want to achieve. You're muted.
Thank you very much. So I think you've already touched on this substantially, but just to go a bit into it. So what is what are, by law in the EU, in Nigeria, what are the protection mechanisms that are in place for investors? So say payday is here and there's a shortfall and obligations cannot be met. What sort of protection mechanisms are in place for investors?
Okay. So first of all, the first protection mechanism is like the loan I talked about, that the revolving credit loan I talked about, that the issuer is most likely going to take, so that once I see shortfall on a payment date, they can borrow money from there and pay. That's one. Then from investors' perspective, which is something that is significantly different between what we have in Nigeria and in the EU. That's what we call having a skin in the game in the EU. So having a skin in the game is a principle whereby if the seller is required to retain certain percentage of that exposure, that is the underlying asset, the security it is issuing, the SPV is issuing. So in the EU is 5%. In other words, if Bank A is selling its underlying portfolios to an SPV, let's say 100 million, the Bank A is expected to buy in that note, buy up to 5% of that note. So ideally, it will sound as if they're not buying it back. But yeah, the aim is just to ensure that the issuer has also a skin in the game. So in the EU, the rules is so broad in such a way that the seller itself, any member of the seller's group of company can actually buy, not necessarily the seller. So if the seller has another subsidiary, the subsidiary can buy the note. It's very fine. We don't have that in Nigeria. We don't have it in our securitization regulation, unless if it's structured in that manner. Of course, you can structure it in that manner in Nigeria, but it's not part of the requirement in our laws. But here in the EU, it's part of the requirement. And for you to get any approval from the regulators, you must show that. It's very important. Then another way to also protect the investor is, which this will not be applicable to Nigeria. This is kind of something that is common in this market, is regulator. So most securitization vehicles, the SPVs, are set up in Luxembourg. Now, Luxembourg has a special insolvency law. So ideally, what should happen is, if, for example, the SPV, because most cases, the SPV can issue. So in Luxembourg, you are allowed to issue securitization portfolio in compartments. Compartments could just mean tranches, in tranche 1, tranche 2, tranche 3. Now, ideally, in other jurisdictions, including Nigeria, what would have happened is, once the SPV defaults, maybe one of the SPV default on one of those tranches, and the SPV becomes insolvent, the investors will have access to all the the SPV's assets. Will have access to all the SPV's assets. In other words, the three tranches ideally will be all the assets. If it's unsecured, we put together, so liquidate it, and the money will be distributed to investors across board in all the tranches. But that's not the case in Luxembourg. So what typically happens in Luxembourg is that if you have an SPV and the SPV issue these securities in tranches or in compartments, what is called compartments. Let's say compartment A, compartment B, compartment C. If there is maybe the SPV becomes insolvent, the investors in compartment A are only entitled to the assets of compartment A, whereby the investors in compartment B are only entitled to assets in compartment B. So even if the asset in compartment A is not enough to meet the obligations of the SPV to the investors do not have recourse to other compartments. So because of that, the insolvency law is what they have in other jurisdictions. In Europe is similar to Nigeria, whereby you can literally put everything together, liquidate, and you pay all investors. So most SPVs are set up in Luxembourg, and because EU is they have this special regime. Once you set up an SPV there, the company can come into any other European member states to do business, issue security. So that challenge is not there. Like maybe like in Nigeria, say you issue security in Ghana, try to sell it in Nigeria. So that challenge is not there for them. It's just like literally like you issue security in Lagos, I want to sell it in Abuja. So that is what it is like in the market here. So that's another way of protecting the investors from that very angle. Then another way of protecting investors, of course, you have the asset, basically the underlying asset, security be created over those assets in favor of investors. And usually you want to, in the EU, you want to put provisions that want to limit investors from bringing insolvency proceeding against the SPV. So it's very important because the SPV might have issued securities in different tranches, and if an investor is allowed to bring an insolvency proceeding against an SPV, it may have a triple effect on all other assets the SPV might have issued. So these are some of the ways of protecting the investors. And of course, you'd have done your this in your numbers. The SPV, the sellers here that is packaging this whole stuff would have done its numbers and before issuing securities. And the investors are also on their own part, usually as sophisticated investors, they would have also done their own numbers before investing.
Okay. So just another question. What would you say the reason why the Nigerian market hasn't fully tapped into securitization transactions? What would you say the reason is? Is it a regulatory? Is it due to the fact that maybe we don't have as enhanced regulatory backing for it? Or it's just something that, our market hasn't developed to start to adopt? Because it seems like something that is not too frequent in the Nigerian markets.
Yes, I think the main thing is lack of understanding of what it's all about. I think that's the main thing because, like I made mention of course, I know that our mortgage market is not that well developed, so we shouldn't be seeing a lot. There are not much mortgages transactions happening in the Nigerian market, so our market is not that developed. But there are many other things you can do, securitization, many other things. So, for example, if you go to Computer Village right now, I know that if you want to buy a phone and you don't have the money cash, you can start doing this: buy today and pay subsequently. That's a very good one. I mean, if it's a company that has that kind of business model, you can literally sell thousands of phones or thousands of phones to people, and you need money upfront so you can continue doing your business, because these guys are going to pay back maybe in a period of 12 months, 15 months, 24 months, and you need cash. So you can literally package this asset, that is the obligation, in other words, your receivables, and sell it, and you have cash to go and import more phones and continue the business. Of course, I know there are car companies in Nigeria. They can do the same thing. You're selling cars on credit. You still need cash flow. Instead of going back to the bank to go and borrow money, because this is another piece of the game. If you're going to the bank to go and borrow, let's assume you have cars. You sold 100 cars or 1,000 cars on credit, and you go back to the bank to go and borrow money to import more cars. Instead of doing that, you can literally package these cars together and sell these receivables on these cars and sell. You have your cash flow. You go back to the market and buy more cars. So, and in doing that, the good thing about it is that you're going to even do it. It's even cheaper, because most cases, when you go to a bank today, the interest rate is something within the neighborhood of the interbank interest rate is something within the neighborhood of 18.75%. So, and plus margin, obviously, when banks are giving you a loan, they will give you what they call it, LIBOR plus margin. So you're looking at something within 20-something% interest rate. But if you're doing securitization, you can make the interest rate as good as 15%. Most securities that are issued in the market today by good companies are the interest rate is something within the neighborhood of 15%. So you can do that. But the problem, I think, is that lack of knowledge. I think the laws are there. The regulation is there, and it's not even that stringent compared to other markets. So companies can actually benefit from that if they do that. Also, I remember there was one transaction I worked on, securitization transaction. We were almost in the verge of closing, but the problem we had was back in Nigeria anyway. But the problem we had was the investors. They were kind of we're not too familiar with this structure, so that was a problem. So I think there's need for more sensitizations on this, and once we can have that, I think we can do a lot, and you issue securities at cheaper rates than going to the bank to go and raise capital.
Okay, so I think that securitization transactions on a smaller scale remind me a lot of invoice financing, and I know that invoice financing is something that the Nigerian market is really growing to really growing to accept, especially like in the tech space. So I think I would agree that it's something of awareness and acceptance. So you might have seen the Debt Management Office statements on securitization by the federal government. I know there's not much clarity on it, but what are just your general thoughts seeing that on how it's supposedly being structured as well?
Well, first of all, I so when I read, I've been following the school wears and tears loan for a couple of time now, especially when was it IMF or World Bank start suggesting to the CBN that they should securitize this assets, and I don't know. So I was a little bit. When I saw it, and there was no much information. The only information is that the federal government is securitizing those assets, those underlying receivables, and at the same time they're not issuing to the public. So I was a little bit skeptical. I don't really know what the structure is all about, but the whole takeaway is that those securities were not sold to the public. But because of securitization, it means it becomes a liquid asset. It can be transferred from one party to the other. And also, that's a lot of money. I think about 12 trillion. Obviously, about 6 trillion. I can't remember the amount anymore. But I know very well that the federal government, if they had even done it like the proper securitization and issue securities in the market, it would be very difficult to raise that about 12 trillion. It would be very difficult in one tranche, unless probably maybe they want to do it in series. Then that's possible. But for just one tranche, raise that money is going to be very difficult.
So I think it was even about 22 billion, 22 trillion. Yes. So my question then is, yes, but do you think that from a government's perspective, securitization is something that can actually maybe help us in terms of reducing our debt level, or we just don't have that much confidence in the government or have the structures in place that the public would actually invest in this?
No, so it's definitely a very good thing. It's something that we can do. Government at all levels can do it. It's very, very possible. For the federal government, I don't think it will be a problem for the federal government because they are in charge of printing Naira. So worst case scenario, they will print Naira and pay their investors. That's the worst case scenario. But it's possible. So from the state government level, it will be a little bit delicate because even in Nigeria, when state governments issue bonds, one thing that the investors want to see is that's a sinking fund, and at the same time, they are charging the FAC allocation. That's very critical for most investors. Investors are a little bit skeptical with their the state government, charging their IGR accounts because we don't really pay a lot of attention to state government and what they do. The governor can just come on board and decide to say the obligations of my predecessor, I'm not going to continue with them and things like that. So investors are very skeptical. They don't want a situation whereby a new government comes on board and they start, backing out from the deal that was entered by their predecessors. So for state government, it's still possible, but what will have to, happen is that investors may want to see more collateral on ground. That's one thing that they want to see. But for the federal government, I don't really think it will be a very big problem. Federal government issues Sukuk regularly, they issue treasury bill, and in most cases they're oversubscribed. So if they do that for securitization, I believe it will be oversubscribed as well.
So from your experience, working on securitization transactions in Nigeria and outside of Nigeria, what would you say that the take home can be for Nigeria from a regulatory perspective? So what things would you like to see that you think might enhance the markets for it here?
Okay, so I think, first of all, from a regulatory perspective, I think one thing we may need to do is to introduce this retention provision, having a skin in the game is very important. I think it will give investors some confidence. It will boost the confidence of investors. So if, for example, a bank is selling off its loan to an SPV and the SPV is issuing securities on the back of those loans, and the bank is not investing in those securities, people may be skeptical because this could be non-performing loans, even though there are reps and warranties saying that, of course, maybe they're performing loans and what have you. But, you're an investor, you wouldn't want to put out your money out there, and by the end of the day, you have to go to court and sort out your differences. No investors want to go to court. That's the honest truth. So we may need to consider that having a skin in the game provisions. 5% it is what it is here. We can even opt it. Maybe 5% is fine. I don't think it's a bad number. That's one. Then another thing we could do from a regulatory perspective is data protection. I think we don't really, in as much we have data protection laws in Nigeria, I don't think a lot, is being done with respect to that. In the securitization transaction in Nigeria, you're most likely going to see the parties don't really give pay more attention to how to protect the informations of those borrowers, those guys that you're packaging their portfolio. So that's not the case in other jurisdictions because you need to protect the information of these people. It's very critical. We can do something on that. Then issue of maybe sensitization is also important. So one thing is it's a little bit funny. So in the EU here, if, for example, an investor, let's say an EU company wants to invest in securitization portfolio, there's an obligation on that very investor to carry out some high-level due diligence on the issuer, on the sponsor, and on the asset. So that obligation is on the, in as much that the issuer will have to make disclosures and the rest, but there's also an obligation on the investor, an EU investor, to carry out some level of due diligence. And also, the regulation also went further to say that if retail investors are investing, then the issuer and the sponsor will have to do some level of due diligence and, prepare a report for the retailer. So in that very report, what they're going to do is they will look at the level of exposure of the retail investor and, inform him about some basic things about the securitization. And based on the information they have, then they can advise him and prepare a report for him. Also, there's a cap on how much retail investors can invest. In essence, the aim is just to ensure that we protect those investors. So I think we can still do much on that. And also, the regulators can also help with this sensitization because one of the major investors in Nigeria are pension fund administrators. They are some of the major investors in Nigeria. So once the regulators are even extremely familiar with the whole thing and they engage with these, recurrent investors, I think it will to help opening up the market.
I think I really agree, specifically on the skin in the game one, because I know that with SEC, for other transactions or capital markets operations like real estate investment schemes, they have those percentages. I think for real estate investment schemes, as high as 15 to 20%, depending on if it's a trust or a company. And I think that, yes, that would really help. So it's quite shocking that we don't have that in place. On data protection, I think that our challenge now in Nigeria's data protection space is we haven't been able to appropriately apply data protection into traditional scenarios. So the focus is on technology platforms, fintechs, how they're managing data. But even from a traditional perspective, from traditional institutions and traditional sectors, there's no focus on how they also deal with data from data subjects. So I think that's actually something to really consider. On the aspects of retail investors, I know SEC has general provisions, but it would be good to see something more tailored to securitization transactions as well. So just to take us off the topic a bit, what are other trends that you are seeing in your markets when it comes to raising capital? Are there other investment vehicles or alternate investment means that are gaining popularity that you see that may be something that we should start to consider for the coming years?
Yeah, so my markets include Nigeria. That's my primary market. Anyway, this is not my market.
Of course, you are correct. Yeah.
So for that, I think a lot of things are happening in the markets. Things are changing very fast. There are many things. One thing which I'm writing on covered bond, there's something called covered bond. I don't think it's quite common in Nigeria. I'm writing on it. Hopefully, I'll have time to finish it. So it's something that Nigerian may also want to consider. Something that is very common here. And not just common, like a lot of financial institutions, especially banks, are really, really benefiting from it. That's one aspect. So a lot of things actually happen in the market, even from the conventional lending system, our conventional financing system, our conventional M&A need to improve. A lot of things are actually changing. So, for example, I was discussing with someone couple of days ago on the M&A. So he was telling me about reps and warranty insurance for acquisition. I mean, this is something I don't think is common in Nigeria. So, in other words, instead of just giving reps and warranty, you give limited reps and warranty, and the buyer, that is the purchaser, also buys insurance from an insurance company. If any other things happens not to be correct, you can fall back on the insurance. So, a lot of things are actually happening in the markets, and I really understand because our market is still developing. I don't expect it to be, at the peak, at the pinnacle at the moment, but we can still learn a lot and at the same time improve our market. I think the most important thing is just that information flow. We just need to have enough information, and we'll be good to go. I believe so. You're muted.
Thank you. I was saying amazing. We spent quite a bit of time. Still some questions, but I think not to drag it too much. So thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you very much.
I'll allow you give us any last words before you go. But just before you go, I know you don't want to answer personal questions, but just before you go, describe yourself to us in 3 words. So what would you say that you as a person falls into in just 3 words?
Number 1, I like money. That's a joke. Okay, I think in 3 words. 1, I like sharing information. I like sharing ideas. That's one thing about me. I love that a lot. That's one. Then secondly, I like following up, things that are happening in the market. I mean, it's still flow from the first one, because for you to share idea, it means you need to also know what is happening around you. And the other one, which is more social, I like Faji. I love to party, so
that's nice to hear. Yeah. It's needed in this profession.
I'm missing the MBA conference. I wasn't happy I didn't attend the MBA conference because there were a lot of parties there. I don't know.
It was quite something, I would say. There's a lot of controversies about some of the occurrences. Well, I mean, thank you. Any last words for us before you go?
Yeah, okay. My last word would be I think the Nigerian market it's not doing bad, to be very honest with you, it's not doing bad. I know that aside from probably South Africa, the Nigerian market is one of the most busy markets out there. I think Nigerian market is also more busy than some markets, even in Europe. So we have to actually, I'm serious. Not the big countries in Europe anyway.
Yes.
Maybe the smaller ones. So a lot of things actually happening in the Nigerian market, even in other aspects of finance like projects, normal lending, capital markets, and what have you. So, but you can't stop. You keep pushing, and I believe that and also things like I said, information is key. So I see a lot of companies going out to go and borrow money from banks. I'm not saying you shouldn't borrow money from banks anyway, but you can actually do a lot. You can also actually do other things. You can issue bond, even some things as simple as bond. Companies don't even understand how these things are done, and you want to run a global company. These are things that are very important because in most cases they're cheaper. In the Nigerian market, for example, most of our bonds are issued in fixed interest rates, which is very good because I mean interest rates for and something within the neighborhood of 15%, which is good. If you go to a bank, you're looking at floating rates and everything plus margin, couple everything together, you're looking at probably 23% or 25%. So just that we lack those information, and some of our business owners also don't want to self-improve.
Yes.
If you want to really run a business, you really need to self-improve. And one area you must self-improve is in finances. I see business owners, they don't know anything about finances, and you think you want to run a successful business. That will not happen. So in as much as you want to understand the space, the business you're doing, you must also understand your finances. Very important, so that even if somebody is trying to defraud you, you will know what to do and also know how to improve the business from time to time. So this should be, I guess, my parting word, and the markets will pick up very soon. That's what the projections are. I don't know, but the experts, that's what they said.
Yeah, we are hopeful. So thank you very much. I think this has been an exciting session for lawyers, business owners, government officials, and just the general public. It's very important to know what's going on in the market or what could potentially happen in the market. So thank you once again, John. It was
Thank you very much.
having you.
Thank you. Yeah.